Ew, that place really smells.
I can't believe people swim in that filthy lake, and it's so salty.
No, I've never been out there. Why would I want to?
Do you know there used to be whales out there?
Why don't they just change Farmington Bay into something useful, like a freshwater lake?
Great Salt Lake, it's a dead sea. Nothing lives in there.
What's the big deal about Legacy Highway? We need more roads, and all that's out there is a bunch of swamps.
The bugs out there. They'll eat you alive.
Well, you know, there used to be a huge resort and amusement park on the South Shore.
I didn't think people like me are allowed out there.
Oh, those brine flies, they bite.
Welcome to Great Salt Lake. Been here before? Wouldn't surprise me if you said no. A lot of people who live nearby think they know a lot about where they live. Haven't been here before either. It seems to me if your home is anywhere near this giant lake and you haven't been here in a while, or ever at all, you're missing out on a big part of where you live. I used to bump into lots of people who tell me all kinds of things about the lake. Things that weren't very attractive, did not sound very exciting. Then I'd find out they hadn't been here before either. They were just spreading rumors, saying things about the lake that were only partly true, just telling part of the story. I had to come here and see for myself. All this talk about brine shrimp and bugs, foul smells, water so salty you could practically walk on top of it. Millions and millions of birds, wetlands and highways. Have you heard some of that stuff too? I have a confession. I used to be a member of this imaginary club. I call it the Big Salty Buggy Stinky Club. Anybody could join. In fact, if all you knew about Great Salt Lake was that it was big, or salty, or buggy, or stinky, you were automatically a member. 3 things happened a while back that made me quit that club. First, I read in the newspaper about how millions of pounds of brine shrimp eggs had been taken out of Great Salt Lake, dried, put in cans, and sold all around the world. Millions of pounds. I thought, there sure must be a lot of eggs in that lake. But what are brine shrimp doing there besides laying all those eggs to be put in cans and sold around the world? Second, I found out about how sometimes there are over 250 different kinds of birds here from all over the world, eating, resting, nesting, raising their young, and that these birds reach an amazing 5 million in number. I thought to myself, well, that's about as many birds as there are people in Utah, Idaho, and Nevada combined, all at this one lake. What do all these birds know about Great Salt Lake that I don't? And the third thing that made me quit that big, salty, buggy, stinky club? I started coming here. And the things I've seen. Well, my mind is just packed with memories. There was this one time, way out at Promontory Point. Well, hey, instead of me just telling you, why don't I show you? Come on, inside. Let me show you my secret photo album. Great Salt Lake is water. As you can probably imagine, it takes a lot of water to make a Great Salt Lake. About 5 trillion gallons to be exact. Well, give or take a few million. This lake is one of the largest on our continent. But for such a huge lake, it's surprisingly shallow. Some large lakes are 1,000 feet deep. In most places, Great Salt Lake gets to maybe 13 feet. And 32 feet is about the deepest it gets. That's about the height of a school flagpole, or a team of 5 basketball players standing one on top of another. Great Salt Lake is salty, in most places anyway. Up here in the North Arm, the saltiness of the lake, its salinity, is about as high as a lake's water can get, nearly 28%. That's 8 times as salty as the oceans. That color you see? It's not pollution, and it's not Kool-Aid. It's from a species of microscopic bacteria that feels right at home in all that salt. So many of them that their microscopic bodies tint the water pink. But Great Salt Lake has a freshwater personality as well. This surprises some people, yet in the places where rivers and springs flow in, fresh water dilutes the salt water and creates a habitat that's hardly salty at all. Basically, if you were a plant or animal looking for a nice place to live at Great Salt Lake, salty, not salty, or something in between, you'd be pretty sure to find something just right for yourself. So we should really think of Great Salt Lake as a place where a whole variety of different kinds of watery habitats can be found. Great Salt Lake is big. About 335 miles of muddy, rocky, or sandy shoreline. To give you an idea of how big, if you were to try walking completely around this lake, it would be like walking from the Salt Lake Valley all the way to Yellowstone National Park, or way up to Sun Valley, Idaho. There are 10 more or less official islands on Great Salt Lake. Some, such as Gunnison Island pictured here, are so important for faraway birds to come to nest and safely raise their young that they are off limits to people. Antelope Island is the lake's largest. It has a state park with a beach and visitor center, an historic ranch, hiking trails, and famous herds of buffalo and mule deer. Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake. See where the Bear River flows in? And the mouth of the Weber River? Here's where the Jordan River makes its contribution. Now, find where the water flows out. Most lakes have a place where water comes in and another where it leaves. Not our Great Salt Lake. There's only one way water escapes this lake: evaporation. This rare kind of lake with no outlet is called a terminal lake. Every day, the lake finds a balance between billions of gallons flowing in and billions of gallons evaporating out. Great Salt Lake is a shapeshifter. Even though it's been around since giant Lake Bonneville shrank down about 15,000 years ago, this lake hardly ever stays exactly the same. Since it's downhill from everywhere, the lake size between spring and fall, and from one year to the next, really depends on how much flows into it from the rainwater or snowmelt of the surrounding high country. In drier years, the lake shrinks. During the 1960s, Great Salt Lake reached its lowest point in history, which was 11 feet below normal. On the other hand, when our region gets above average amounts of rain or snow, Great Salt Lake can really show off. In a few years after that record low level, it managed to rise higher and higher and higher, over 20 feet, to match an all-time record high that was 10 feet above normal. A lot of people were very surprised at that high lake water of the 1980s, but if they had just looked at the records kept since the 1850s, shown here, they would have known all about Great Salt Lake's changing personality. This graph shows lake elevations measured since way back in 1847. Over all these years, the surface of Great Salt Lake has averaged out at 4,202 feet above sea level, shown here. Here we see that all-time record low of 4,191 feet in 1963. And here are the record highs of nearly 4,212 feet, both in 1873 and again more recently in 1986. Great Salt Lake is human history. Seems there are hundreds of stories about early explorers, settlers, and even a few people who made the lake itself their home. This is the burial marker of Judge and Mrs. Wenner, located on Fremont Island, where they and their family lived for several years during the late 1800s. The famous Kit Carson even left his mark on Fremont Island many years ago when he and John C. Fremont explored the lake's mysteries. From his journals, we know that he painted this cross on September 9th, 1843. Parts of Great Salt Lake are prehistoric. Who do you suppose were the first people to live around our lake? As archaeologists like these have discovered, you have to look a lot farther back than pioneer times. Surrounding this black and white ruler is the outline of what was once a pit house, evidence that people lived at the edge of the lake thousands of years ago. These and other remains that have been hidden under mud since prehistoric times greeted the 20th century after high lake waters rose and fell in the 1980s. There are dozens of locations near Great Salt Lake where bones, tools, and other signs of prehistoric humans have been uncovered, providing an exciting glimpse of people long gone, people who probably knew this lake a lot better than we do. Great Salt Lake is a weather maker. The lake's huge size, vast open space, and abundant water causes some spectacular summer storms. This one was observed while camping on Promontory Point. Stars coming out overhead, but intense lightning and downpour 30 miles away. And as you might know, our lake can have a huge effect on snowfall. This is because lake evaporation provides lots of moisture to storms crossing the lake before reaching the foothills and rising up our mountains. These skiers don't realize it, but they're skiing on Great Salt Lake on loan. We call this the lake effect. With millions of gallons of water evaporating from the lake every hour, moist air rises over the lake to build clouds, moved eastward by prevailing winds toward the Wasatch Range. Because rising air cools, clouds pushed to higher elevations can't hold all that moisture, so intense rain or snowfall often results. Great Salt Lake is minerals. We call it salt water, but there are a lot more kinds of minerals dissolved in this lake than just common salt. Where do all these minerals come from that make this lake a salt lake? Well, think of every river and stream as a sort of liquid conveyor belt, transporting not only water, but dissolved mountains, bit by tiny bit, from places up high to the lake down below. What are parts of mountains today could be dissolved in Great Salt Lake tomorrow. In fact, the lake contains at least 32 minerals that are mined for our use. Right at this moment, between 4.5 and 5 billion tons of different minerals are dissolved in Great Salt Lake. And every year, over 2 million more tons of dissolved minerals flow down from area mountains. Enough minerals to fill 70,000 railroad boxcars each year. 6 mining companies on Great Salt Lake extract 3.5 million tons of different minerals each year. Whenever you see salt used on winter roads, or ride a bicycle made of metal, or have your clothes washed with detergent, or eat foods grown on fertilized fields, you're seeing minerals from Great Salt Lake being put to use. For many people, mining means hard hats, shovels, and picks, and deep holes in the earth. But to get minerals out of Great Salt Lake, water is just pumped into shallow evaporation ponds, such as these. There, the sun and the wind do most of the work, evaporating the water and leaving the minerals behind. Great Salt Lake is big business. Besides mining, there are businesses that specialize in harvesting life from the lake. At first, the interest was in the lake's tiny brine shrimp, shown being collected here for use as fish food. But today, it's mostly the shrimp eggs that get people's attention. Here, pictured on a dime, are the brine shrimp eggs that can be found floating in the lake. I told you they were tiny. You can fit over 30 brine shrimp eggs in the space of that little black dot we call a period at the end of a sentence in a book. Looks here like you can fit about 5 eggs in Roosevelt's nostrils. Now we are looking down from an airplane at 2 large boats on the lake. That tan color you see is billions of floating brine shrimp eggs. Between the boats is something called a boom, used to gather up the eggs. A 1-pound can like this contains around 130 million brine shrimp eggs. Beginning in the fall, many tons of eggs are collected, dried, and canned for sale all around the world for as much as $50 a can, or more. Who would pay that much? Well, you would if you were a prawn farmer. Prawns are those bigger kind of shrimp that people eat, and prawns love to be fed tiny brine shrimp. So prawn farmers, mostly in Asia, buy cans of brine shrimp eggs to hatch into food for their prawns. Adult prawns are then shipped to grocery stores and restaurants all over the world. Almost all, 90% of the world's brine shrimp eggs used on these prawn farms come from our own Great Salt Lake. These are super sacks loaded with brine shrimp eggs from Great Salt Lake. Each of these weighs as much as 2,000 pounds. An unbelievable amount of brine shrimp eggs have been collected from the lake. Curiously, the brine shrimp population can change dramatically from one year to the next. Here is a graph showing the millions of pounds of shrimp eggs taken from the lake between the years 1985 and 2000. You can see how in the early years, more and more eggs were collected from one year to the next. Then look, between 1991 and 94, the harvest numbers went down, even though there were more companies than ever out gathering eggs on the lake. In both 1995 and 96, record harvests of over 14 million pounds were gathered, only to have harvest numbers drop drastically for the 3 years following. People began to wonder, what's going on? Are brine shrimp in trouble? Then look, the 2000-2001 harvest season broke all previous records with a harvest of almost 20 million pounds of brine shrimp eggs, surprising everyone. The mystery continues. For future updates about this harvest, go to the USGS website or contact Friends of Great Salt Lake. Well, we know there are years when there are a lot fewer brine shrimp in the lake, and fewer shrimp mean fewer brine shrimp eggs. But what causes the number of brine shrimp to change so much? What do you think? Overharvesting? Water temperature? Changes in salinity? Not enough algae in the lake for shrimp to eat? Maybe a combination of causes. No one really knows. Each year, the harvesters pay a $10,000 fee for each permit, and much of this money is now going into research about brine shrimp to answer these kinds of questions. Maybe if you choose a career in wildlife biology, you could help in this research. We'll be doing a close-up and personal visit with brine shrimp later on, but first, there's more to add to our What is Great Salt Lake list. Great Salt Lake is science. Besides studying the brine shrimp in the water, scientists use airboats to go out and learn more about how wildlife around the lake are doing, where they go, and what they eat. Great Salt Lake is adventure, like sailing with the wind so far out onto the lake that it seems you have entered another world. There's even a tour boat that people can take out on the lake during the summer, passing close to some of the islands and seeing views of the lake most don't get to see. There are trails for horseback riding, bicycling, and hiking at Great Salt Lake, offering impressive views of lake scenery and wildlife. And some have discovered one of the lake's best-kept secrets, how fun swimming and floating in the lake can be. Last but not least, Great Salt Lake is impressive. Those who visit Great Salt Lake and get to know it begin to think of it as a shy friend, taken for granted and hardly noticed until suddenly it's full of adventure and colorful surprises. Lake sunsets are famous among photographers nationwide. What a beautiful landscape. Or is it a seascape? Well, are you starting to develop your own clearer picture of what's going on here? The more I visit this lake, the more I realize how lucky I am. I'm now on the Frary Peak Trail on Antelope Island, home of Antelope Island State Park. Way down there, it's the beach where we first met.
Well, look who's here.
Whoa, Lynn, what brings you here?
Abby did. She wanted to show me some recent discoveries she's made. Abby, this is Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Abby, pleasure to meet you.
You too. Who are they?
Oh, those are some new friends of mine. Hopefully, future friends of Great Salt Lake. I've been sharing stories about the lake with them. We may have a few members of the Big Salty Buggy Stinky Club among us, but we're working on that.
Have you told them how misunderstood and unknown the lake is to so many people?
You bet.
And have you told them that of all the things Great Salt Lake is, most important is that it's a home?
Not yet.
Well, Have you shown them the many different habitats and different plants and animals that live in the Great Salt Lake ecosystem?
I was getting to that. I really was.
Tell you what, we're going to finish this hike, then meet you down below where all kinds of life is busy making a living. We think you'll be pretty amazed.
Do you mind if I join you?
Sure. Come along.
See you later.
Hey, over there, aren't those the wetlands?
They are, the Layton wetlands, in fact.
I've never been there.
Avocet.
Brine fly.
California gull.
Dragonfly.
Eared grebe.
Phalarope.
Hey, phalarope starts with a P, not an F.
All right. Fox.
Gopher.
Horned toad.
Ibis. White-faced ibis. That counts.
We're playing this game where you take turns going through the alphabet, naming animals you know that live at Great Salt Lake. We're at Layton Wetlands Preserve, one of several very important places at Great Salt Lake, where animals in their homes are being protected. Thousands and thousands of birds nest in the shallow waters, not too far from where I'm standing right now. I'll catch up to them later, but now let me tell you what I think is really neat about Great Salt Lake. Perhaps of all the things Great Salt Lake is, the most important is that it's part of a remarkable system, the greater Great Salt Lake ecosystem. Similar to the way your own body is a system, with different parts working together to make you, you. The greater Great Salt Lake ecosystem is a system of connected parts, including mountains, salt flats, and marshes. This map shows Great Salt Lake's circulatory system. Your own body's circulatory system delivers life-giving blood. Great Salt Lake's circulatory system delivers life-giving water, carried through its network of rivers and streams. These streams cover hundreds of miles from parts of 4 states: Nevada, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah. Here are the watersheds of the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River. The heart of our greater Great Salt Lake ecosystem is, of course, Great Salt Lake itself, and all the expressions of life found in and around it. Much of that life is found in places called wetlands. Wetlands are areas covered with shallow water at least some of the time, having special kinds of soil and plants, and providing food and shelter for a variety of animals. As a nation, we are just beginning to realize the mistakes we have made by filling in and destroying over half our country's precious wetlands. For now we know that wetlands provide habitat to many important, and sometimes rare, plants and animals. Plus, wetlands serve to slow the destructive forces of fast-moving water. They control flooding, reduce erosion, and help replenish our groundwater. And similar to our own kidneys, wetlands are nature's purification filters, absorbing pollutants and improving water quality. Wetlands like these are very special in a state as dry as Utah. Only about 1% of our entire state is wetlands, and 3/4 of this, over 400,000 acres, are right here along the shores of Great Salt Lake. Drier portions in the lake circle of life hold more hidden meaning. Some just see them as flat and lifeless, but these low, flat areas, called playas, are best appreciated over time. For one thing, they serve as buffer zones, wide spaces protecting life along the water from outside dangers. But they are also habitats in waiting. Over time, a high-speed movie would show us water levels gradually rising or lowering, with different plants and animals following these changing lake moods. This image from space shows us some features in and around Great Salt Lake: Salt Lake City, the Wasatch Range, Antelope Island, and look at this. Here's a 23-mile Rockville Causeway that was built in 1959 for a railroad shortcut across the lake. Notice something strange? Building the causeway has strangled the lake in the middle. Since almost all the rivers enter Great Salt Lake from the east, or the south. That causeway now prevents water and salt from mixing between the north and south. Here's a closer look at what the railroad causeway does to Great Salt Lake. The saltier north arm is on the right. While the south parts of the lake have been getting more diluted, the north arm has become saltier and saltier. Hardly anything can live up there anymore. Recognizing this situation, people are beginning to talk about how this imbalance might harm the lake, and ways we might help to make the lake whole again. You know the expressions, beauty is only skin deep, and you can't tell a book by its cover. Well, that's easy to forget when you're first getting to know Great Salt Lake. It's just natural, I guess, to be more attracted to colorful things, like these flowers by the lake. But good things also come in smaller or less showy plant and animal packages. We all know it is a mistake to judge another person by how they look or where they live. We should be careful not to make the same mistake with our lake and what lives there. For example, look like a bunch of weeds? All these different plant neighborhoods around Great Salt Lake are the homes and restaurants for animals. This vegetation also helps the lake adjust to periods of rising or lowering water. And they help protect the lake from too much damage or interference from us. Now, when someone decides to build something too close to the lake, they think of rising waters as a threat. But flooding has always been part of the lake's personality, helping to clean and improve the soil and to start whole new generations of plants. Add salt to your houseplants and you'd probably kill them. But plants at Great Salt Lake are a splendid example of adaptation. Shown next to a dime, these are sprouts of pickleweed in spring, growing in salty soils near the shores of the lake. By summer, this plant grows up to a foot tall. As its roots suck the salty water from the ground, the dissolved salts are being pulled out of the water and discarded in special chambers inside those spongy leaves. This way, the plant produces the salt-free water it needs for growth all summer long. As an added bonus, people can even eat pickleweed. Its name gives you a hint of how it tastes. Of course, there are some other plants that can make you sick, so you never want to eat any plant unless you have an expert there to help you identify it. Other marvelous adaptations of Great Salt Lake plants include salt secretion, sort of like sweating. That's what this saltgrass does. See the crystals? Let's see the grass on your lawn do that. Different plants mean food and homes for different insects, and there are hundreds of important insect species at the lake. The insects here died in a storm and were washed ashore. Look at some of the different kinds of insects making a living at Great Salt Lake. Maybe you don't get very excited about insects, but where there is a healthy population of insects, there are bound to be lots of other critters. For many animals, insects mean food. Insect eaters, such as this yellow-headed blackbird, are among the many birds, reptiles, and fish who feast on the lake's insect bounty. Some think there are no fish in Great Salt Lake. Not true. The lake's center may be too salty, but 23 species of fish have been identified in the streams, springs, and marsh areas of the lake. Many of these fish feed on water plants and insects, and then become food themselves for other fish, birds, and mammals. Great Salt Lake is home to 9 different lizard species, as well as 8 different frogs and salamanders, 2 kinds of turtles, and 8 species of snakes. Almost camouflaged in this picture is a Great Basin pocket mouse, one of 64 species of wild mammals who make their living around Great Salt Lake. And there are owls here. These burrowing owls live in the rocky, shrubby areas around the lake and are great fun to watch. Burrowing owls are even active during the day, feeding on small rodents, lizards, and insects. For shelter, they usually take residence in burrows left by other ground animals. And here's a neat trick. When they're disturbed, burrowing owls scare danger away by making a very convincing noise that sounds just like a rattlesnake. The bison, or buffalo, is a famous native to the region, first introduced to Antelope Island over 100 years ago. And then there's the American pronghorn, or antelope. So many existed on the island in 1844 that Kit Carson and John Fremont named Antelope Island after them. A visit to Great Salt Lake reveals many stories about the balance of life in a healthy natural system. Predators such as this coyote or its smaller relative, the red fox, can seem like threats when people want the landscape to be like they want it. But in nature, the jobs of predators have always been quite important. Other predators here include members of the weasel family, such as this long-tailed weasel out hunting for a mousy meal. And the badger, a highly adapted digger finding food in the form of burrowing rodents, reptiles, and insects. But life important to Great Salt Lake can be found not only in wetlands or up along the shores, but right there in the lake itself. As a matter of fact, in this container of lake water are the two heroes upon whom practically all life at Great Salt Lake depends. Let's look inside the cup. I first direct your attention to the little critter in the center, a brine fly larva. Sort of like a swimming caterpillar, it will soon transform into an adult brine fly. These larvae don't get very big. They're only about as long as your fingernail is wide. The brine fly story begins each spring, after female flies each lay about 100 eggs on the lake surface. The eggs hatch and grow into the swimming larvae we just saw in the cup. These larvae eventually swim down to the lake bottom, where there is a salad bar of underwater plants to munch on. After a few days of pigging out, each larva forms a hard pupal shell around itself, and the metamorphosis begins. Finally, an air chamber inside the pupal shell causes it to float back up to the surface, where the adult fly crawls out to take off and begin its new life as a brine fly. During summer, the lake shores show us how successful brine flies can be. Here you can see piles of the empty fly pupal cases washed up on shore. That uncomfortable smell the lake occasionally shares with us is not the lake itself, which has a rather refreshing salty sea smell like an ocean, but that famous odor is a clue that soil making is going on. With dry breezes and a hot summer sun, shoreline deposits, like those brine fly pupal cases, are just borrowing our noses to announce their slow but stinky decomposition back to Earth. There are actually 2 species of brine flies on the lake. The good news is that they don't bite and they seldom land on people. If you're being bugged by bugs at the lake, it's probably not the brine flies. Here some brine flies are munching on their own empty pupal cases, kind of like a baby eating its own crib. And there sure are a lot of them. According to researchers from Utah State University, up to 5,000 billion brine flies hatch at Great Salt Lake each year. During any moment on a summer's day, there can be about 110 billion flies along the lake shoreline. Yet, each adult brine fly lives just 3 or 4 days. During their brief lives, they eat gigantic amounts of algae, bacteria, and other natural materials. In fact, brine flies are Great Salt Lake's professional cleanup crew. As larvae and adults, they remove about 120,000 tons of waste from the lake every year. Without the flies, algae would take over the lake, and Great Salt Lake as we know it would no longer exist. It really would become a dead sea, and all this life we've seen would be without a home. Now that you know the secrets about one Great Salt Lake hero, let's plunge back into our cup of lake water. Those other tiny objects surrounding the fly larva? They're brine shrimp, and brine shrimp eggs. The brine shrimp story begins with an early spring bloom of phytoplankton, tiny floating water plants that are the brine shrimp's favorite food. Brine shrimp have an impressive way to increase their numbers in a hurry. In spring or summer, after they hatch from those tiny floating eggs, they eat lots of algae, grow up in just 2 or 3 weeks, and seek out a partner. And then, instead of laying eggs like you'd expect, the females give birth to as many as 25 live young. A lot of those little specks you see here among the adults are newborn brine shrimp. Can you tell them females from the males? Here's a female. Notice the pouch with developing young inside. Here is a male. Even as adults, brine shrimp are not very big. Look at your thumbnail. You could fit 5 or 6 brine shrimp into that little space. With the right temperatures, good food, and the right salinity, brine shrimp will live up to 3 months and produce several generations of young. By late summer, the growing populations of shrimp and flies have managed to eat most of the lake's algae. Without food to feed live young, the shrimp instinctively switch to laying those hard-shelled eggs. Here are millions of eggs floating on the lake. Someone who didn't know any better might see this and complain about some ugly scum or pollution in the water, when what they're really looking at is the future life at Great Salt Lake. As winter sets in, nearly all the brine shrimp in the lake have died. The water has become too cold, and the algae shrimp need for food are gone. Now, the future of the entire shrimp species depends on those overwintering eggs. Each spring, Great Salt Lake experiences another instant shrimp population, and the cycle continues. Brine shrimp survive best when the salinity is between 13 and 19%, because that's when the type of tiny green algae they need to eat grows best. Remember how the lake north of the railroad causeway is up near 28% salinity? That's too salty for shrimp. South of the causeway it's only 8 or 9%, which might not be salty enough. Hopefully, by studying brine shrimp ecology, and with everyone's support, we can begin to repair some of the problems we have caused our lake's ecosystem. Now you might be thinking, I can see why the brine flies are considered heroes of Great Salt Lake, because they help clean up floating waste and control the algae. But why worry about whether or not there are lots of brine shrimp? What makes them such Great Salt Lake heroes? A hint to the answer lies in this picture. Floating on the water we see the light brown dusting of brine shrimp eggs, the dark brown brine fly pupal cases, and that white object? A feather. It's about birds. You might think of Great Salt Lake as a giant bird magnet. We have world-class gatherings of birds here. Birds who depend on our lake as one of the world's best places for food and protection, for safety to lay eggs and raise their young, and for resting during their migration. Sometimes there are birds as far as the eye can see. 5 million birds live at or visit Great Salt Lake each year. Nearly 2.5 times the number of people in the entire state of Utah. And there are over 250 different bird species here. Let me introduce you to a few feathered friends. The Wilson's phalarope is a brine shrimp and fly eater. Over 500,000 migrate here in the summer, after nesting farther north. Great Salt Lake hosts the largest gathering of Wilson's phalaropes in the world, and more than half of our entire planet's population. During their visit here, phalaropes shed their old feathers and grow new ones to then fly non-stop, 60 hours and 3,000 miles to South America, taking off with up to 100% added fat and body weight, thanks to the brine shrimp and flies. 280,000 red-necked phalaropes have been estimated here on a single day. Notice the phalarope's feeding technique. Spinning a swirl of water that draws the shrimp swimming down below right up to the surface. Eared grebes are also brine shrimp eaters. Grebes will dive and swim in the red patches of hatching brine shrimp, using their tongues to squeeze the salt water from their mouths before they swallow. Over 1 million eared grebes have been counted here, making Great Salt Lake one of the largest migratory gatherings of the species on the North American continent. Some 250,000 avocets depend on the services of Great Salt Lake, many more than any other wetland in the West. Here, you can see a food chain in progress. Sunlight causes the algae to grow, which is food for the brine flies, which are food for the avocet. Here's an avocet dating scene of worldwide importance. About 10,000 avocets come here to raise their young each year. Here are more brine fly feeders. The population of black-necked stilts reaches 65,000 at the lake, again much higher than any other location in North America. Great Salt Lake has the largest gatherings of the rare snowy plover in the world. These brine fly eaters live in those salt flats, or playas, scraping shallow nests right out of the ground. Here we get a rare peek at a snowy plover's well-camouflaged young. Because many don't know about these special birds, people using off-road vehicles on the lake's south shore sometimes run over plover eggs and chicks without even knowing it. About 28,000 white-faced ibis rely on Great Salt Lake for breeding, the world's largest breeding population. Recognize this famous bird? Utah's state bird, the California gull. It's attracted to the rare safety of the lake's nesting areas. I don't know why they're called California gulls. Great Salt Lake has more of this species coming here to raise young than anywhere else on Earth. About 160,000 of them. One of their favorite foods? Brine flies. And up to 17,000 adult pelicans depend on Great Salt Lake for raising nearly 4,000 young here each year on Gunnison Island. Pelicans feed in distant freshwater marshes and rivers, sometimes traveling up to 200 miles a day to gather fish. Ducks, including these northern pintails, are also special residents at the lake. Quite a few people are members of duck clubs here. They hunt ducks in the fall and pay back the lake by helping to protect and preserve wetlands for ducks and many other wild residents. Knowing just a few of these Great Salt Lake stories begins to give each of us a clearer picture of what Great Salt Lake is. It's one huge system of life, and we haven't even mentioned the hundreds of other species that live here. All the hawks and eagles and rabbits and pack rats and geese and swans and bees and dragonflies and shrews and voles.
Before we go back to our homes, there's something I need to say about Great Salt Lake's future. Great Salt Lake is our neighbor. Nearly 2 million of us live right next to it. As neighbors, we need to be thinking carefully about the kinds of decisions we make about activities near and around the lake, because these changes can disturb or destroy habitat and disturb or destroy the life we've discovered lives here. Imagine someone messing around in your home. A few years ago, at an important meeting about the lake, scientists identified 3 problems Great Salt Lake has with us. Want to know what they are? Well, for one thing, we keep filling in and breaking up wetlands. Another problem? Dividing the lake with causeways and dikes. And the third and most important problem for Great Salt Lake, well, this is where we all come in. Our own ignorance. People like you and me just not knowing about the lake and its ecosystem. So I have a question for all of us. How can we continue to grow as a city and as a state and still have a great Salt Lake?
We do hope that you and your family and friends come to understand and appreciate this big salty neighbor of ours, as well as my friends and I do. Because if we don't all know about Great Salt Lake, how can we be sure to take good care of it?
Are these brine-fly pupal cases?
They sure are. Look at the opening at one end. You can see where the adult brine fly popped out and flew away after transforming from a larva.
Metamorphosis!
Yes!
Oh, where'd you find those?
Over there.
Check.